I am Mary Thompson. This year I am 68, and all my life I had believed that my family was a peaceful painting, a devoted husband, an obedient son, and a simple yet happy future. But there are secrets, silent cracks, just waiting for the right moment to tear everything apart. On my son Thomas's wedding day, it should have been the happiest day of my life. Yet the moment the bride walked down the aisle, I saw something different in her eyes, not joy, but coldness, like a suspended sentence hanging above us. And then, amidst the music and blessings, a sentence cut through like a sharp blade. Your family owes us. From that moment, happiness turned into tragedy. The past of my late husband, the man I once loved, was torn open, and fragments of shattered memories scattered around me. My son lost faith in the image of his father, while my daughter-in-law, Isabella, revealed her true purpose. This marriage was nothing more than a game of revenge. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. My name is Mary Thompson, 68 years old, a widow who has lived nearly 10 years in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. People often say that when you lose your life partner, the world loses half its colors. I believed that for many years. But today, in the early morning air, with the kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee, I knew my world had found a new reason to shine again. My son Thomas's wedding day. Thomas is everything to me. The child I once cradled in my arms has now grown into a tall, steady young man. I can still recall him as a boy, running circles in the backyard, his eyes glowing whenever Richard, my husband, taught him to throw a ball. Today, Thomas wore a tailored suit with a navy blue tie, and I realized those same eyes still sparkled just as brightly. The only difference was that instead of a ball, he now held tightly the wedding bouquet for his bride. "Mom," Thomas whispered in my ear as he adjusted his collar. "I can't believe this day has come." I smiled, my aged hand gently brushing his shoulder. "I believe it. And so would your father, if he were still here." The wedding was one of those rare occasions when my usually quiet home turned lively. Neighbors came bustling in, some carrying apple pies, others with roses, each of them complimenting Thomas on how handsome he looked. Laughter and chatter blended with the soft music playing from the speakers in the yard, pulling me back into the memories of my youth. I felt as though I were standing inside a sweet dream, the kind every mother longs for, to see her son begin his own family. While the guests mingled, I stepped aside for a moment. I watched Thomas bowing his head politely, shaking hands, his gentle smile lighting up his face. I remembered the difficult years after Richard passed, when it was just the two of us. There were days I thought I would never stand back up, but Thomas had grown through the love and strength his father never had the chance to give. Looking at him now, my heart brimmed with hope. Perhaps the losses we endured were not in vain. The gentle chime of glasses echoed across the hall. A relative raised his cup. "To Thomas and the bride, Isabella, may you be happy for life." Everyone cheered in unison, the clinking of glasses ringing like a celebratory melody. I lifted my glass and smiled beneath the shimmering glow of the chandelier. In that moment, I truly believed that life could open into a new chapter, warm and full of color. Yet amid all the joy, my heart sank for a beat. Surrounded by smiling faces, I still felt an immense emptiness beside me. Richard should have been here today. He would have straightened Thomas's tie, patted his shoulder with his strong hand, and said, "Son, I'm proud of you." I closed my eyes briefly, and memories swept over me like the wind. Richard in his uniform, tall and strong, stepping down from an old truck. While I ran to embrace him tightly, there was a night, long ago, when he whispered in my ear, "One day, we'll walk Thomas down the aisle together, and watch him begin a family of his own." That promise never came true. He left too soon, leaving me to weather countless cold nights alone. I opened my eyes and quickly wiped away the tear that had just fallen. "Richard, I wish you could see today how much our son has grown." The prelude of music swelled, announcing the crucial moment. Everyone rose to their feet, eyes turning toward the door. My heart pounded as I turned as well. The chapel doors opened, and Isabella appeared in a pristine white gown. Lace embraced her slender shoulders, a small wreath rested upon her soft brown hair, and her shoes tapped lightly against the tiled floor. The whole room seemed to hold its breath before her beauty. Thomas looked at his bride with adoration, his smile brighter than ever. I smiled too, silently whispering in my heart, "This is the moment of happiness my son truly deserves." And yet, as Isabella drew closer, I suddenly noticed something strange. Among the hundreds of gazes, the bride's eyes did not shine as I had hoped. There was no sparkle of joy, no glimmer of anticipation. Instead, they were cold, sharp like a blade hidden beneath velvet. In that instant, Isabella flicked her gaze toward me. Just a brief glance, so quick that no one else could have noticed, but it was enough to send a chill through me. It was not the look of a young woman stepping blissfully into marriage. It felt more like a warning. Applause thundered through the chapel, but I stood frozen, my heart pierced by a sudden, nameless dread. I could not explain it, nor did I have any proof, but I knew, with unsettling certainty, something was wrong, waiting for my family just ahead. Music filled the chapel, mingling with applause and cheers. I stood still, watching my son slip the ring onto his bride's finger. Thomas's hands trembled slightly, his lips quivering as he spoke his vows, while Isabella smiled in return. Yet that smile, something about it struck me as strange. It was not the smile of a young woman who had just become a wife, not the radiant happiness I had always imagined. That smile was as fragile as morning mist, but behind it lay a coldness in her eyes, sharp as a breeze cutting through a spring morning. I tilted my head, wondering, am I being too sensitive? Is it just my longing for Richard clouding my thoughts? But then, in the moment Isabella placed her hand in Thomas's, I caught her glance at me, not quite hostile but certainly void of warmth. When the pastor declared them husband and wife, the hall erupted with cheers. I stepped forward toward the stage, ready to embrace my new daughter-in-law, as any mother would. But Isabella shifted subtly, gracefully, letting my arms fall into empty air. Just a small gesture, yet it froze me in place for several seconds. Thomas, oblivious, threw his arms around me. "Mom, I'm so happy." I forced a smile, hugging my son back, trying to bury the hollowness creeping into my chest. "Yes, son, I'm happy for you too." In that moment, I knew I had to remain silent. This was Thomas's day of joy. Yet my heart had already begun to grow heavy. The reception went on. Guests raised their glasses. The rhythm of dance music filled the hall. Couples spun beneath the golden lights. I sat at the main table, my eyes fixed on the young pair. Thomas guided his wife tenderly, while Isabella smiled just enough to avoid suspicion. Yet her gaze never matched her lips. A guest leaned close to me and whispered, "The bride is beautiful, but doesn't she seem a little cold?" I could only press my lips into a polite smile. How could I admit that I felt the same? When it came time to cut the cake, I seized the chance to approach Isabella. I wanted at least one genuine moment between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law on this first day. Gently, I placed my hand on her shoulder. "Isabella, you must be tired. I'm truly glad you've joined this family today." She paused for the briefest moment, then turned to me with a half-smile. "Thank you, Mary. Not Mom, not Mother, just Mary." The word cut deep into my heart. The tone was polite, yet the icy distance in her eyes left me breathless. I steadied my face into calm composure. "From now on, we are family. If you need anything, just come to me." Isabella nodded, her lips moving as if to say something, then silence. Not another word. That moment was brief, yet unbearably heavy. I suddenly understood that an invisible boundary had been drawn from the very beginning. And though the groom's mother was standing outside that wall, the music still played. But the atmosphere had shifted. From somewhere among the tables, I caught a whisper. Is the bride not happy? A woman leaned toward her friend, speaking softly, yet clear enough for me to hear. The other covered her mouth, nodding, her gaze fixed on Isabella, who stood beside Thomas with that vague, unreadable smile. I clenched my handkerchief, telling myself, no, this is just an illusion. Every wedding tires the bride. Perhaps that's why Isabella seems unhappy. Yet the more I watched, the more I felt the invisible distance widening between them. Thomas was different. My son tried his best to play the perfect groom. He smiled brightly, raising his glass again and again to toast the guests. When he noticed Isabella standing quietly at his side, he slipped an arm around her waist, whispered something in her ear, trying to coax a laugh. Sometimes Isabella's lips curled faintly, but her eyes never shared in his joy. To smooth over the awkwardness, Thomas led his wife onto the dance floor. He clasped her hand, spinning her to the sweet rhythm. Applause erupted across the hall. I watched, my heart torn between relief and unease. In Thomas's arms, Isabella smiled, but it was still a smile like a mask. A relative sitting beside me sighed. Mary, your son is radiant with happiness. But why do I feel the bride has no spark at all? I kept my composure and replied softly, she must be tired. Weddings are exhausting, after all. I smiled, but even I did not believe my own words. As the night wore on, the celebration drew to a close. Guests began to leave, until only family and a few close friends remained. I seized the chance to approach my daughter-in-law again. This time, I refused to let the moment slip into cold distance. Isabella, I said gently, I know today must have been tiring, but I truly hope you feel welcomed into this family. She turned to look at me. That gaze made me shiver, cold, direct, as if probing my very thoughts. Then, unexpectedly, Isabella smiled, a graceful smile, yet one that never touched her eyes. Mother. She paused a second, tilted her head, and spoke softly. Just enough for me to hear. You don't know everything yet. I froze. My heart pounded wildly, as though I had just heard a threat wrapped in velvet. I searched her young face for even a flicker of warmth, but all I found was the shadow hiding behind her smile. Round us, guests still laughed and chatted. Thomas still held his wife's hand, blissfully unaware. And I stood there, trembling in my deep blue dress, sensing that a door had just opened, a door leading to secrets that could shatter everything I thought I had held together. The music still played, laughter still filled the hall, but inside me a storm was rising. I tried to push away Isabella's words. You don't know everything yet. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps I was simply too sensitive. Yet the unease clung to me like a shadow. Thomas led his wife back to the main table, and they sat down beside me. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, inviting the newlyweds to share a few words of thanks with the guests. I watched as Thomas took the microphone, his cheeks flushed with wine but his eyes alight with joy. His voice trembled, yet rang with sincerity. Thank you all for coming to celebrate with our family. I know that my father, Richard, if he were still here, would be so very proud. Applause thundered through the hall. I lifted my head, my vision blurred by tears. Richard, if only you could see today. Thomas handed the microphone to Isabella. The whole room waited for the bride to speak. Isabella smiled, her lips curving softly, and her clear voice rang out. Thank you, everyone. Just as Thomas said, surely his father would be very proud today. After all, she paused, her eyes sweeping slowly across the room. He did leave behind some unforgettable memories for my family. The room fell silent. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks, brows furrowed. I sat frozen, my heart racing wildly. My family? Thomas turned to her, confused. What do you mean? Isabella kept her graceful smile, as though she had just told a charming little joke. But I could see the steel beneath it, From behind, a guest whispered. What is she implying? Something about the groom's father? The murmurs spread quickly, like sparks catching dry grass. I forced myself to stand, raising a trembling hand. Please, everyone, don't mind it. She's just a little emotional. My voice shook, but I prayed it would be enough to calm the room. Thomas clutched his wife's hand, leaning close. Isabella, what are you trying to say in front of everyone? Today is our wedding day. Isabella met his eyes directly, her red lips parting to release each word slowly. I only want to remind you, the past never truly disappears. Isn't that right, Mother Mary? I felt as if I had been turned to stone. Dozens of eyes bore into me. My lips pressed tight, my throat constricted. I couldn't speak a single word. The guests began to murmur. A distant aunt exclaimed, Good heavens! What's going on? Is there some kind of secret? One of Richard's old friends furrowed his brows, glancing at me expectantly, as though waiting for an explanation. I wanted to scream, Stop it! Don't drag Richard into this in front of everyone. But my legs felt rooted to the floor. Thomas looked from his wife to me, his face pale with confusion. Mom, I don't understand. What is she talking about? I swallowed hard, trying to find an answer. But under the weight of all those stares, every word died in my throat. Isabella calmly set the microphone down, taking her seat with a serene smile, as if nothing had just happened. But I knew, in that instant, my son's wedding had already veered onto a different path. The hall hung in awkward silence after Isabella's cryptic remark. The laughter that once filled the air had vanished, replaced by uneasy whispers. I forced a smile, though my hands trembled. The wine in my glass rippled, threatening to spill. And then, through that silence, the banquet doors opened. A woman stepped inside. The moment my eyes met hers, my breath caught. Victoria Carter. She wore a dark dress, her posture regal, each step carrying the air of someone who belonged here. But what sent a shiver through me was not her attire, it was her gaze. It was not the gaze of a guest come to offer congratulations. It brimmed with resentment, sharp as a dagger aimed straight at my chest. Late, but I still made it. Victoria's voice rang out, cold and unwavering. Some guests awkwardly shifted aside to make room for her. The entire hall sank into a suffocating tension. Thomas blinked, bewildered. Who is she? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, Isabella rose to her feet and strode toward the woman. The smile on my daughter-in-law's face was different now, radiant, yet filled with a strange pride. I'm glad you came, Mother, Isabella declared, her voice clear. Gasps rippled through the room. All eyes turned in shock toward the main table. My heart plummeted to the floor. So this was Isabella's mother, Victoria Carter. And in that instant, fragments of memory returned. Richard's vague, unfinished words years ago. The silence whenever I had questioned him. I had heard that name before, only half spoken, half buried. Now, standing here before me, it carried the weight of a secret I was never meant to uncover. Victoria did not so much as glance at Thomas, nor at me. She stopped in front of Isabella, took her daughter's hand, then turned toward the hall, her gaze cold as steel. Today, I did not come to give blessings. I came only to remind you that some debts never disappear. A murmur rippled through the room. Some guests covered their mouths, others sighed or looked bewildered. The day of joy had suddenly become a hidden courtroom, with everyone waiting for a verdict of guilt. I sat frozen, my throat constricted. Thomas turned to me in confusion, his eyes wide with panic. Mom, what's happening? Why is my wife? Why is my mother-in-law? I had no words. The air in the hall grew heavier with each passing second. The music had stopped. Whispers echoed from table to table. Faces that once shone with delight now sagged with bewilderment and curiosity. The celebration, the day I had long awaited, was sinking into shadows. Isabella turned to me then. She walked slowly, her eyes locked on mine, her smile curving like someone who already held victory in her grasp. When she stood beside my chair, she leaned down, her lips close to my ear, and whispered a single sentence meant only for me. "Your family owes us." Each word struck like a blade driven straight into my heart. I went rigid, the entire hall spinning around me. My son's wedding, a day meant to be the beginning of joy, had become the stage for a play of revenge. And I was the one dragged under the spotlight. The wedding night should have been the sweetest moment of Thomas's life. Yet the air in the house was thick with unease. After the guests had left, I gathered the few dishes left on the table, my ears still echoing with Isabella's words. "Your family owes us." I could not shake the image of Victoria's gaze, nor stop trembling at my daughter-in-law's enigmatic smile. Tonight, I should have been resting, holding onto warm memories, waiting to hear the playful laughter of the young couple in their new room. Instead, every step I took through the house felt like the echo of an invisible verdict. Thomas gently led his wife upstairs. I watched them go, whispering a silent prayer. If only tonight passes quietly. Tomorrow everything will be fine. But I was wrong. Less than an hour later, the sound of arguing erupted from the upstairs room. Thomas's voice rang out, angry yet trembling. "Isabella, you have to explain. Why did you say that in front of everyone?" There was a pause. Then Isabella's voice dry, cutting. "You're so naive, Thomas. Do you really think marriage is only love and roses? Every marriage comes with a price." My heart clenched. I stood at the foot of the stairs, gripping the wooden banister so tightly my knuckles whitened. I dared not move, only listened as each word pierced me like a needle. Thomas spoke again, his voice cracking. "What price? I don't understand. What are you saying about my father? About my family?" Footsteps thudded across the floor above. Then Isabella's voice grew louder, as if she wanted me to hear. "Your family once brought pain to my mother. Your father left a scar that never healed. And now, you will pay for it." I staggered, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the handkerchief I was clutching. "Richard, what did you do to leave behind such a shadow?" In the room, Thomas tried to hold himself steady. "I love you, Isabella. I married you because I believed in this love. If my father made mistakes, that was his doing, not mine." A short, cold laugh slipped from Isabella's throat. "You don't understand. Your love is only a piece of my plan, and that plan begins tonight." I stumbled back toward the living room, unable to bear another word. Every sentence from her lips was like ice water poured over my heart. The wedding night, meant to be filled with tender whispers, had become a courtroom of accusations. I collapsed onto the sofa, my eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Questions swirled endlessly in my mind. "Richard, what did you hide? And why must my son pay for your sins?" I sat in the darkened living room, my back pressed against the chair, clutching a pillow as though it could keep me from falling apart. Memories of Richard surged back like a relentless tide. There were nights when he said he had to leave for urgent business trips, slipping out with a small suitcase, returning only days later with his clothes carrying a faint trace of unfamiliar perfume. I had once asked him, "Richard, where do you go?" without ever telling me clearly. He had smiled awkwardly, kissed my forehead, and said, "Just business, Mary, don't worry." And I had believed him, because I wanted to believe. But now, with Isabella's cruel words echoing in my ears, those silences of the past had become cracks I could no longer deny. The phone rang, shattering the gloom. I grabbed it. It was Dorothy. "Mary, I heard at the wedding. Something happened?" Her voice trembled. At the sound of my dearest friend, tears spilled over. I recounted briefly what Isabella had said, and the shocking appearance of Victoria. On the other end, silence lingered before Dorothy sighed. "I always knew Richard. He wasn't a perfect man, and sometimes, even we friends noticed he kept many secrets. Do you remember? He used to vanish on weekends, excusing himself with meetings. But no one really knew where he went." I bit my lip, tears dripping onto the back of my hand. "Don't say that. Dorothy. I couldn't bear it if it were all true. Her voice softened. I just want you to be prepared. But I believe, if he did wrong, he surely regretted it. A man like Richard, he wasn't heartless. The conversation left me both comforted and unsettled. If even my closest friend had once doubted him, what could I cling to now? I rose and stepped into the room where Richard's mementos were kept. Each drawer, each photograph was arranged neatly, like a small museum of our married life. I brushed my fingers over our wedding photo. His eyes in the picture seemed to gaze straight at me, with the warm smile I had loved so dearly. As I rifled through an old drawer, a yellowed envelope slipped out and fell to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding. On its surface, in Richard's familiar handwriting, were the words, "To Mary, when you need to know the truth." My hands trembled as I sank back into the chair, slowly opening it. Inside was a letter, the paper worn, the ink slightly smudged. Yet every word still clear as though it had been written yesterday. The golden lamplight fell across the page. I drew a deep breath, bracing myself to face the past I had avoided for so long. I sat motionless, the letter trembling in my hands. The golden light fell across its worn creases, making Richard's handwriting seem to rise from another world. I drew a deep breath and began to read. Mary, if you have found this letter, I am no longer by your side. I do not know the circumstances under which you will read it, but there is something I must confess. I made a mistake that not only hurt you, but also reached into another family, the Carter family. I froze. My vision blurred. My fingers trembled as they traced those two words, Carter. There was a time when I was weak, when work weighed heavily on me, and I felt distant even within my own home. In that moment, I let my heart stray. Victoria Carter was the one who entered my life then. Mary, I betrayed you. My chest tightened. Each word was a knife carving into memory. I remembered the nights Richard claimed urgent business trips, the unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirts. I had convinced myself it was all imagination, but now, in his own hand, he had confirmed it. I know no apology can erase the pain. I only want you to understand. I never stopped loving you. With Victoria, it was nothing more than a reckless infatuation, but its consequences became a wound both families must carry. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Oh God, Richard, how could you?" I turned to the next page. I tried to atone in my own way, quietly supporting the Carter family when they were in need. But I never dared to tell you. I was afraid of losing you, afraid of destroying the home we built. If one day the truth comes to light, I only hope you understand. Everything I kept hidden, I did it to protect you and Thomas. I clutched the letter tightly, the paper edges damp with my tears. My throat tightened, and I managed only a broken murmur. Carter. That's Isabella's last name. The truth struck me like a blow. My daughter-in-law was not only Thomas's bride, she bore the legacy of the wound Richard had left behind. I felt as though I were standing between two worlds. On one side, the son I loved with all my heart. On the other, the ghost of my husband's past. And now, both had collided inside this very house, on the very day that was supposed to be perfect. I sat motionless for a long time, Richard's letter still open in my lap. The ink had faded with age, yet every word seemed to echo in the air, carving deeper into my heart. The truth had begun to surface, but not clearly enough for me to grasp. Richard had spoken of the Carter family, confessed his mistake, and then hastily cloaked it with words of protecting you and Thomas. But protect us how? Protect us by hiding everything, only for it to erupt on my son's wedding day? Protect us by leaving me a widow to face Victoria's resentful gaze and Isabella's cold smile alone? I folded the letter and pressed it tightly to my chest. Questions swirled endlessly in my mind. Should I tell Thomas? If he knew, would he still see his father as a hero? Would he still believe in the happiness of the marriage he had just entered? My heart was torn in two. On one side was the truth bare, painful, undeniable. On the other was my only son, innocent, joyful, just beginning his married life. I stood caught between them, as if balanced on the edge of a chasm. While my thoughts spun in chaos, I heard the upstairs door creak open. Footsteps echoed down the staircase. I hurriedly slipped the letter into my pocket and wiped away my tears. Isabella appeared in the doorway of the living room. She was still in her white gown, but under the golden light, the lace seemed draped in shadows. She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. It was not the look of a newlywed bride, it was the look of someone entering battle, certain of her victory. Without a word, Isabella stepped closer. The space between us shrank until only a few feet remained. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears, my hand instinctively tightening around the letter in my pocket. Then she tilted her head slightly, a faint smile curving her lips, her gaze never leaving mine. That look was a silent challenge, as if to say, "So, you know the secret now. But what will you do?" I stood frozen, a chill racing down my spine. In that instant, I realized the real battle had not yet begun, and the woman standing before me, Isabella, had no intention of retreating. That night, I could not sleep. Richard's letter still burned in my mind, every word pressing heavily against my chest. Yet what unsettled me most was Isabella's gaze, the defiant look. That told me the real battle had only just begun. The next morning, while Thomas went out to buy a few things for breakfast, Isabella appeared in the doorway of the living room. I sat with a cup of cold coffee in my hands as she walked in, her hair tied back, her face stripped of the timid sweetness of a new bride. Her eyes were sharp, unwavering. "We need to talk," she said firmly. I nodded, forcing composure. "I think so too." She sat across from me, her hands clasped together, her eyes locked on mine. "Do you know why I agreed to this marriage? It wasn't for love. It wasn't because I wanted to be the dutiful daughter-in-law you hoped for." My throat tightened. "Then why?" Her lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "Because of hatred. Since childhood, I've heard my mother repeat the name Richard Thompson, the man who made promises, then abandoned her. He left her to live in shame, in humiliation. And I grew up inside that bitterness. My body trembled, my heart clamped in pain. Richard, he was wrong. I won't deny it. But that was the past. You can't take that past out on Thomas." A short, cold laugh slipped from her lips. "The past. Perhaps for you, it has ended. But for me and my mother, it never did." I grew up watching her cry in silence, listening to her speak of a disgrace that could never be erased. And I swore, one day, the Thompson family would pay. I clenched my hands tightly on my knees, fighting to keep my voice calm. "So you married Thomas, only for revenge? You turned the happiest day of his life into a weapon to feed your hatred?" Isabella's gaze drilled into mine, unflinching. "Yes, I've been waiting for this day. To watch you squirm before the guests. To see my mother walk in with her eyes full of fury. To show you that your family will never live in peace. And believe me, this is only the beginning." The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. My chest ached as I sat facing Isabella, realizing that my son had just stepped into a marriage born not of love, but of vengeance. I swallowed hard, forcing gentleness into my tone. "My dear, your father-in-law is gone. He has no chance to explain himself. But Thomas is different. He is innocent. He loves you sincerely. You cannot destroy his happiness to avenge the past." Her eyes narrowed, a mocking smile tugging at her lips. "You always defend your son. But what about my mother? Who defended her when Richard abandoned her? Who dried her tears in the endless nights? No one. That's why I'll do it now." I drew a deep breath, clinging to a fragile hope. If Richard was guilty, perhaps he tried to make amends. "Perhaps you don't know the whole." "Enough." Isabella cut me off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Do you think a few excuses from you can erase the years of pain we carried? I don't want your words. I only want to see you and your family humiliated, as my mother once was. Just then, the front door opened. Thomas returned, a bag of bread and milk in his hands. He froze when he saw us sitting opposite each other, the air thick with tension. "What's going on here?" he asked. Frowning as he set the bag down, Isabella turned to her husband, a fleeting cold smile crossing her face before vanishing. "I was just telling your mother the truth about how your father betrayed my mother." Thomas's face drained of color, his voice breaking. "What? No. What nonsense are you saying? Your father wasn't as perfect as you believed," Isabella said evenly, though every word was edged like a blade. "He caused my mother's suffering. And this marriage," she paused, turning her fiery gaze on me, her eyes glinting with challenge, "is the price your family must pay." Thomas staggered back a step, his eyes fixed on me. "Mom, is this true? Did father really?" My throat closed. I wanted to shield the image of the husband and father my son cherished. Yet I knew I could not deny everything outright. The anguish in Thomas's eyes cut deeper than any knife. All I could do was shake my head, tears welling. I don't have an answer for you." Isabella folded her arms, a cold smile curving her lips like the edge of winter wind. "You'll find out soon enough, Thomas. I promise. I'll show the whole world what your father did to my mother. And when that day comes, no one will believe in the so-called perfect family your mother has always been so proud of." Under the pale, unforgiving light, Isabella's words resounded like a sentence pronounced in court. I sat trembling, torn apart by sorrow for my son, and the terrifying certainty that a true storm was about to break upon us. After the wedding, the house I had always known suddenly felt unbearably small. Thomas, with sincere eyes, told me that he and Isabella would stay with me for a while to save money and to keep me from being lonely. I smiled and nodded, hiding the quiet fear gnawing at me. I wanted to believe that, though distance lay between Isabella and me, time would soften it. But only a few days later, that fragile hope began to crack. On the very first morning, when I laid out breakfast, just some toast, fried eggs, and coffee, Isabella glanced at the table, then set down her knife and fork, her lips curling in disdain. "I'm used to a different kind of breakfast," she said bluntly. "At my mother's house, there was always fresh fruit and juice." Thomas gave a nervous smile, squeezing her hand gently. "Darling, Mom's cooking is wonderful. Try it, you might like it." Isabella lifted a piece of toast, bit into it as though swallowing medicine, then placed it back down. Her eyes flicked over me without a shred of gratitude. I sat still, trying to keep calm, though inside I ached. I could not fault a young woman for her habits, but the way she made her point so openly, so coldly, was her way of telling me I would never be enough. In the days that followed, tensions only grew. One afternoon, as I rearranged the living room and hung an old wedding photo of Richard and me, Isabella passed by, stared at it, and said icily, "Do you really need to hang his picture everywhere? Not everyone has good memories of Richard, you know." I froze, my hands trembling so badly the frame nearly slipped. Thomas, overhearing, snapped sharply, "Isabella, how can you say that? He's my father and your father-in-law." Isabella shrugged and turned away, leaving behind a heavy silence. Every evening, dinner felt like a silent battlefield. I placed food on my son's plate. He forced a smile to hold the peace, while Isabella sat upright, her gaze indifferent, sometimes letting slip a barbed remark sharp enough to leave me speechless. Once, I hinted gently, "Isabella, if you like, I can show you a few dishes Thomas loved as a boy." She scoffed, eyes fixed on her plate. "I think Thomas is grown enough to choose his own meals without reminders." The table froze in silence. Thomas quickly interjected, "Please, darling, Mom only means well." But Isabella's eyes locked on me cold, unyielding, making it clear that in this house, my voice no longer carried weight. Day by day, the home once filled with memories of Richard and me became foreign. Thomas's laughter still echoed, but beneath it were sighs, furrowed brows, and a silence heavy with strain, and I walked the old wooden floors feeling each step press against a fragile line. A line Isabella had drawn bold, unmistakable, casting me as nothing more than a shadow in my own home. The tension did not fade in the days that followed. Thomas was trapped between the two women he loved most, his mother and his wife. I could see exhaustion etched into his face with each passing day. One evening, after yet another strained, silent dinner, Thomas sat beside me in the living room. He ruffled his hair and let out a weary sigh. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore. I love you both. I don't want either of you to be hurt. But it feels like everything is only getting worse." I placed a hand on his shoulder, fighting back tears. "My son, I understand, but these wounds, they aren't yours. They began long ago, with your father." Thomas looked at me, bewildered. "So, were the things Isabella said before the wedding true?" I was silent. I could not lie, but I also did not want my son to lose all faith in the image of his father. In the end, I only shook my head softly. "One day you will understand. But for now, what you need is to keep your heart at peace." Thomas bowed his head and gripped my hand. I felt him tremble, a grown man standing on a fragile, broken line. The next day Dorothy came by. She brought a basket of apple pies, but when she saw my dazed face, her smile vanished. We sat on the porch, the afternoon sun stretching across the steps. "Mary, you look terribly thin. Is living together really that hard?" Dorothy asked quietly. I sighed and recounted the conflicts. How Isabella often openly belittled me in front of Thomas. Dorothy listened in silence, her brow furrowing with worry. "I told you before," she said softly. "There's something about Isabella that made me uneasy. Not just the coldness. She carries a plan, a calculation. You must be careful, Mary, and if necessary, prepare for the worst." Dorothy's words sent a chill through me. I did not want to believe my daughter-in-law harbored such malice, but remembering each look and each remark, I knew my friend had not exaggerated. That evening, just after I had cleared the table, Isabella suddenly stepped out of the bedroom. She held a small wooden box in her hands. Her face was composed, but her eyes flashed with pride. She placed the box on the table and pushed it toward Thomas and me. "This is something my mother kept for many years, and now, I think it's time this family faced the truth." Thomas frowned. "Isabella, what are you planning to do now?" Isabella opened the box. Under the lamp's glow lay a stack of old yellowed photographs. At a glance I recognized Richard, my late husband, grinning, standing next to Victoria Carter. The way they looked at one another, more intimate than anything I had wanted to admit. The room froze. I held my breath. Thomas stared at the photo, his lips trembling. Isabella folded her arms, a triumphant smile curving her mouth like someone who had just made a decisive move. "This is only the beginning," she said slowly. "Mother, get ready. People are going to learn much more about your husband's past." In that moment, I understood the real war had begun, and this time, Isabella was no longer hiding her intent. I stared at the photograph on the table as if my blood had drained away. In the faded picture, Richard looked clear and youthful, full of life. He stood beside Victoria Carter, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling broadly at the camera. That smile was so familiar it made my heart ache. It was the smile I had once thought he reserved only for me. "No, this can't be," I murmured, my voice choking. My fingers trembled as they touched the photo's edge, as if one more touch would release the past and swallow the present whole. Isabella crossed her arms and faced me, her voice hard. "Do you still want to deny it? This is clear evidence. Your husband didn't just betray you, he betrayed my whole family." Thomas snatched the photo up, eyes wide in disbelief. "No, my father. He couldn't have done that. How long will you keep denying it?" Isabella snapped. 4 years my mother lived in shame. And your family? You lived in the halo of a perfect man. Do you know what that feels like? Thomas shook his head, his voice strangled. I didn't know. I never knew. My father never told me. I gripped my hands tightly, forcing myself to breathe steadier. Isabella, I do not deny that Richard made mistakes. But please understand, he was still my husband, Thomas's father. A photograph doesn't tell the whole story. A photograph doesn't tell the whole story? Isabella laughed bitterly. What are you waiting for then? Another love letter? Another confession? Enough. The truth is exposed right before your eyes. Thomas threw the photo onto the table. The sound echoed sharply. Stop it, Isabella. This is our wedding day, the beginning of our marriage. Why do you keep turning it into a trial against my father? Isabella spun toward him, fury flashing in her eyes. Because you and your mother pretend not to know. I didn't marry you to daydream about love. I married you to demand justice for my mother. Do you think your love can wipe away the stain your father left? I stepped forward, my voice shaking but firm. Child, don't let hatred lead you. Thomas shouldn't have to pay for his father's sins. You're destroying your own marriage. Isabella turned away, her gaze cold as ice sweeping over me. You say that because you're afraid the world will see Richard's true face. But I will not let the past be buried any longer. The room descended into a storm. Thomas clutched his head, his face drained white. I looked at my son and felt a stabbing pain. He had just lost his illusion of the perfect father, and he watched the love of his life turn their marriage into a chessboard of revenge. And I stood between them, torn by two forces. The loving memories I once trusted, and the harsh truth now laid bare. The ticking of the clock echoed in the silence, heavy as tolling bells that seemed to announce my family's peace was gone forever. Thomas stood frozen in the living room. In his trembling hands, the photograph shook. His once bright eyes blurred with red as he fought against breaking down. Father, he whispered, almost to himself. All these years, I thought you were my role model, a man of honor, devoted to his family. And now, his voice cracked, splintering into a hoarse murmur. It was all just an illusion. I rushed to him, placing my hand on his shoulder. But he brushed it away gently. Mom, why didn't you tell me? How much did you know about this? Tears streamed down my face. My son, I only discovered part of the truth myself. I'm hurting just as you are now. I never wanted you to see your father this way. Thomas clenched his fists, turning his face aside. Do you know? I used to proudly tell my friends my father was the best man in the world. And now, I feel like a fool. I had no words to soothe him. All I could do was collapse onto a chair, covering my face with my hands, my heart breaking apart. Memories of Richard surged in my mind, his smile, afternoons of playing catch with Thomas, family dinners that once felt so warm. All of it crumbled like a sandcastle against the tide. Isabella watched, her face unmoved. When Thomas finally let the photo fall onto the table, she spoke slowly, each word cutting clear. Does it hurt, Thomas? To find out the father you worshipped was a betrayer? To know your family was built on lies? Shut up, Isabella, Thomas shouted, his voice shattering. I don't need you to remind me. I've already lost enough. But Isabella didn't retreat. She folded her arms, her icy gaze sliding over me before locking on Thomas. You say you've lost. No, this is only the beginning. I will show the world your father's true face. And when that happens, the Thompsons will have nowhere left to hide. Her words reverberated through the quiet room, each one like a hammer blow striking stone. I lifted my head, meeting that merciless gaze, and in that instant, I knew what we were enduring now was only the prologue to a long, raging storm. After that chaotic evening, the house grew heavier than ever. Thomas avoided conversation, locking himself in his study. Isabella moved about with a chilling calm, as if she had just won an important match. And I sank into the silence of endless nights, My heart weighed down like stone. One afternoon, Dorothy came by. The moment she saw me, she pulled me into a tight embrace, her voice trembling with worry. "Mary, you look so worn out." Thomas told me. Something terrible happened. I told her everything. The photographs, the accusations, Isabella's resentful gaze. Dorothy fell silent, then slowly nodded, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "Mary," she said carefully, "I must be honest. Years ago, we Richard's friends used to whisper about his mysterious trips. He always claimed it was for business, but no one truly knew where he went. Once, I even heard someone say they saw him in Springfield with a strange woman. I didn't dare tell you then. I thought it might only be gossip." At her words, my chest constricted. Fragments of memory surfaced in my mind. Richard leaving on a Friday night with a small suitcase. I had asked where he was going, and he gave only a curt reply. "Work. I'll be back in a few days." I remembered the mornings he returned, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt collars. I had asked, and he had laughed, pulling me close. "Mary, you worry too much." I was only meeting clients, and I had believed him. Or perhaps I had wanted to believe him because back then, I didn't have the courage to look deeper. Now, with Dorothy's words echoing, every small detail I once ignored lined up into a damning chain. Those trips, they had meaning. They were tied to Victoria, tied to today's tragedy. "Mary," Dorothy whispered, clasping my hand. "I know saying this only deepens your pain, but maybe the truth has been there all along. Isabella has only pulled down the curtain." Tears rolled down my cheeks, no longer sudden, but slow, as though my soul had surrendered to memory. I whispered, "Richard, why did you leave me such a heavy legacy?" Dorothy held me close, comforting me like an elder sister. Yet in her eyes, I saw not only compassion, but also fear. Fear that what we had endured so far was only the beginning of something far worse. In the days that followed, Thomas was no longer himself. He spoke little, his face gaunt, his eyes clouded as if he had lost his direction. Many times I knocked on his study door, carrying a cup of tea, but my son only nodded before sinking back into silence. One night, when I entered after knocking, Thomas sat at his desk, the photo of Richard and Victoria given to us by Isabella lying before him. He turned it in his hands, his voice hoarse. "Mom, my entire childhood was built on the image of a model father. He was my pride. And now, looking at this photo, I feel betrayed. Father didn't just deceive you. He deceived me too." I knelt beside my son's chair, clasping his hand. "My dear, your father may have made mistakes, but that doesn't mean every memory you shared with him was a lie. Do you remember those afternoons he took you to play catch? The joy in your smile back then, that was real." Thomas shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "But how do I separate them? How do I know which part of him was the loving father, and which part was the betrayer? I can't." His words tore at my heart. I knew that once trust is broken, it is almost impossible to mend. And the man who had caused it all was no longer here to face the truth, to explain himself. Meanwhile, Isabella grew more assured by the day, almost as if she controlled the very air in the house. She walked with quiet authority, her words outwardly calm yet sharp as arrows. Before Thomas, she played the role of the wounded wife carrying her mother's grief. But before me, her eyes always carried defiance. One evening, as we sat at the table, Isabella spoke casually. "Thomas, I don't blame you, but you must understand my family suffered greatly. Now it is your family's turn to face the truth." Thomas lifted his head, his lips trembling. "But does that truth really need to turn our marriage into a battlefield?" Isabella smiled faintly, setting down her spoon. Her voice was soft, but each word cut like a knife. "Sometimes, to find justice, someone has to pay. I chose this path long ago." I sat there, my heart breaking. Watching my son sink deeper into the web of control Isabella had spun. He loved her, and that very love was becoming his chain. In despair, I prayed for a way out. And then, as if my prayer had been heard, a shadow appeared. One afternoon, as I watered the flower beds in the yard, a familiar figure appeared at the gate. An elderly man, thin, wearing a worn hat. As he drew closer, I recognized those eyes, the eyes of Richard's old comrade from the army, Mary. He rasped, his voice rough with age. "It's been a long time. I have something I need to tell you." "About Richard?" I froze, the watering can slipping from my grasp. In that instant, I knew another missing piece of the truth was about to emerge. The man stood on my porch, thin and weathered, yet his gaze was steady. I recognized him at once. Walter Harris, Richard's old comrade from the army. I had not seen him in years, and yet here he was, appearing just when my world was collapsing. I invited Walter inside. We sat in the living room, the dim glow of the table lamp casting shadows over his lined face. My hands trembled as I poured him a cup of tea. "Walter, why have you come now?" I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. He sighed, clasping his hands tightly. "Mary, I heard about Thomas's wedding, and everything that happened. I knew the truth would surface sooner or later. I can't stay silent anymore. It's time you and Thomas knew the rest." My heart pounded. "The rest?" Walter nodded. "It's true. Richard betrayed you once. He had a relationship with Victoria Carter. I won't deny it. But what no one has told you is this. Richard ended it very early, and he spent many years after trying to make amends." I held my breath, tears threatening to spill, tears of grief, yet mixed with a fragile spark of hope. "Make amends? How?" Walter's eyes locked onto mine, firm and unwavering. "Richard quietly supported the Carter family financially. I was the one who helped transfer some of those funds. He didn't want anyone to know, especially you. He was afraid you'd misunderstand, afraid Thomas would grow up burdened by it. But I can tell you this. Richard never turned his back on responsibility. He tried to do the right thing, he just chose to keep it hidden." My hand flew to my mouth, my heart racing. Richard's letter echoed in my memory. I tried to atone in my own way, quietly supporting the Carter family. At the time, I hadn't dared to believe it. Now, here was a living witness to confirm it. "Oh, Richard," I whispered, crying and yet smiling bitterly at once. Walter gave a solemn nod. "I know what Isabella is doing pains you, but remember, she only knows half the story. She grew up inside her mother's bitterness, because Victoria never told her the rest. Richard wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a coward. He left you and Thomas more than you realize." The room fell into silence. I sat there, my heart torn open yet strangely soothed by this new fragment of truth. The story was incomplete, but at least Richard wasn't entirely the betrayer Isabella had painted him to be. And in that moment, I knew I had to find a way to bring this truth into the light. Before hatred swept my family away completely, Walter sat quietly for a moment, then reached into the old canvas bag he carried. From it, he drew out a worn bundle of documents. Placing it on the table, he pushed it gently toward me. "These are the bank records I kept," Walter said quietly. "Richard asked me to send the money through an anonymous account to support the Carter family. He never wanted anyone to know, not Isabella, not Victoria. I held onto them for years, planning to burn them. But now, I believe you need them." I opened the folder. The papers were yellowed, the ink smudged in places, but the numbers stood out clearly. Regular transfers, steady for years. The dates aligned perfectly with the mysterious trips I had once questioned. My heart clenched. So he had not abandoned them entirely. He had tried to atone, in his own way. He had just hidden it too well. "Isabella," I whispered, "all her life, she's only known half the truth." Walter nodded. "Exactly. She grew up on her mother's version, Victoria's words. But Victoria never mentioned this money. Perhaps she couldn't accept it. Or perhaps she didn't want her daughter's hatred to fade. And now, that hatred has become the weapon Isabella carries into your home. I clutched the papers to my chest, tears running freely. For the first time in weeks, a faint light flickered in my heart. Not because Richard's actions could erase his betrayal, but because this truth might save my son. He needed to know his father was not entirely the cold-hearted betrayer Isabella had painted. "Walter," I said, my voice breaking, "you've given me a way forward. Thank you for keeping these records." His thin hand rested gently on mine. "Mary, use them at the right moment. Don't let Isabella twist the truth into only half a story." When Walter left, I remained at the table, the worn file before me. My hands trembled as I turned each page, reading the numbers, the signatures, the dates. Each sheet stood as a silent witness to the regret Richard had carried. And in that moment, I knew the time to confront everything had come. Isabella believed she held every piece of the game, but she did not know of this missing fragment, these records of Richard's secret reparations. And that fragment would change everything. I knew I could not delay any longer. Hatred was consuming Thomas by the day, while Isabella grew ever more triumphant, as though victory already belonged to her. So I chose an evening, when everyone was present, to finally lay the truth on the table. I carried the worn folder Walter had given me and set it down in the middle of the dining table. The yellowed papers glowed under the warm light, casting an even heavier shadow over the tense air. "Isabella, Victoria," my voice trembled, yet it was steady enough. "There is something neither of you has ever known. Richard was guilty, I won't deny that. But he did not abandon you. This is the proof." Isabella frowned, folding her arms. Victoria flinched slightly, her gaze flickering before it returned to its cold mask. I opened the file, spreading out the bank records. For years, Richard secretly sent financial support to the Carter family. Here is Walter Harris's signature, his old comrade, the one who handled the transfers. This isn't just my word. Isabella leaned forward, glanced at the papers, then let out a sharp laugh. "And you think a few crumpled pieces of paper can erase what your husband did? A single photograph of him smiling with my mother is enough to prove it all." Victoria stayed silent, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Her eyes darted toward the records for the briefest moment, betraying her unease before she quickly looked away. "Isabella," I said, my voice breaking but resolute, "you only ever known half the truth. Thomas's father was not perfect, but he tried to atone. If you truly want justice, then you must face the whole story, not just the part that feeds your hatred. No, you're lying." Isabella slammed her hand on the table, her voice trembling now. "You're only trying to protect your family's honor." Thomas rose to his feet, stepping toward his wife. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. He took Isabella's hand gently, his voice raw with pleading. "Isabella, please, at least listen to my mother. I know my father sinned, I don't deny it, but I also know he loved this family. I don't want our love buried beneath old grudges. Please, just once, listen." The room fell into silence. I saw Isabella's shoulders quiver, though her eyes remained cold as ice. Victoria still said nothing, her gaze flicking once more at the papers before she turned away. I understood then. This was only the beginning of the confrontation, but at least the truth was no longer hidden. And my son, though broken and desperate, still clung to a fragile hope. That love might yet rescue them from the ruins. The air in the room erupted like a flame striking oil. "Enough!" Isabella screamed, her eyes blazing, her voice trembling with fury and grief. "I don't believe it. All my life I've heard my mother tell of the humiliation Richard Thompson caused her. He abandoned her, left us in darkness. And now you expect me to believe he atoned? Ridiculous." Thomas stepped forward, gripping his wife's shoulders. "Isabella, I beg you, open your eyes. Look, these aren't empty words. These are records, numbers, years. No one could fabricate all of this. Isabella tore herself free, whirling on me, her gaze burning. You're just covering his sins. You can't admit your husband was a traitor, so you invent these payments to cleanse him. Victoria had been silent until then, her face taut with strain. I saw her hand trembling, nails digging into the table. At last, she stood abruptly, her voice hoarse. Enough, Isabella. The room froze. Isabella turned, eyes wide. Mother, what did you just say? Victoria drew a deep breath, as though summoning every ounce of courage. You don't know everything. Yes, Richard betrayed me. But he sent money, for years. I know because I was the one who received it. Isabella's face went blank, as though the ground had collapsed beneath her feet. No, that's a lie. You always told me we were never helped, that we had to bear the shame alone. Victoria turned away, tears streaking her cheeks. I hid it from you. I didn't want you to see him as a decent man. I wanted you to hate him, so you'd never believe in a man's promises. But it's true. That money kept us alive through the hardest years. Isabella staggered back, her whole body trembling. No, it can't be. I grew up with hatred. I lived believing we were abandoned. And now you tell me it was only half the truth. The room echoed with ragged breaths. Thomas looked at his wife, his eyes wet with tears. Isabella, do you see now? Things weren't as you believed. My father sinned. Yes, but he tried to make amends. You can't take half a truth and use it to destroy our lives. Isabella buried her face in her hands, sobs breaking free, first muffled, then spilling into wrenching cries. She collapsed into a chair, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Her voice cracked through her sobs. So, all these years, I was living a lie. My whole life, nothing but a lie. I watched her, my heart twisting. No longer did I see defiance or coldness in her eyes, but the wounded gaze of a child who had just discovered that the foundation of her life was built on sand. And in that moment, I understood. Isabella's revenge had reached its limit. What remained now was her collapse. Isabella bowed her head, both hands covering her face, her sobs tearing through the room. Years of hatred, nurtured like a second heartbeat, collapsed in a single instant. I looked at her, the daughter-in-law I had once seen only as an enemy, and now she seemed like a lost child, adrift with nothing left to cling to. Thomas knelt beside his wife, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders. Isabella, I'm sorry. I can't imagine how many years you've lived in the shadow of hatred. But now you're not alone. You have me. My love is real, not an illusion. Not half a truth like the one you were forced to carry. Isabella lifted her face, eyes swollen and red, mascara streaking into dark lines. You don't understand, Thomas. My whole life was built on one story. That your father destroyed my family. I made it my reason to exist, my strength. And now, it's gone. I feel empty. Thomas cupped her cheek, his voice shaking yet steady. You don't have to be strong because of hatred anymore. You can be strong because of love. We can start over, not bound to my father's past or your mother's pain. Just trust me. Just let go. I sat in silence, tears flowing down my cheeks. My heart, hardened by days of conflict, softened at last. In Isabella's eyes, I no longer saw an adversary, but a young woman forced down a path of darkness, now desperate for a way out. Unable to hold back, I moved closer, kneeling beside her. I placed a hand on her shoulder, then pulled her into my arms. She stiffened at first, but soon her body shook harder, her sobs rising. My daughter, I whispered, speaking from the depths of my heart, not out of duty, not only for Thomas, but from genuine compassion. I'm sorry you had to carry this burden all these years, but from now on, you don't have to bear it alone. You have us. Isabella buried her face in my shoulder, crying with raw abandon. I held her tight, overwhelmed by a strange mixture of pain and relief. At last, the wall between us had cracked, and perhaps It was beginning to crumble. She wept in my arms, while Thomas held her hand tightly, as though afraid that if he let go, she would vanish before his eyes. In that moment, the room once roaring with hatred quieted, leaving only the sound of a young woman grieving the collapse of her life's foundation. I lifted my gaze and met Victoria's eyes. She stood on the other side of the table, her shoulders trembling, her face taut as if wrestling with her own conscience. At last, she stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Mary, I owe you an apology." I tightened my embrace around Isabella, my heart sinking. "An apology?" Victoria drew a sharp breath, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I raised my daughter in hatred. I let her grow up on a story that was only half true. I thought it would make her strong, help her avoid repeating my pain. But I was wrong. I gave her a burden too heavy to bear, and now she is the one most destroyed by it." Isabella lifted her tear-streaked face to her mother. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me live in the dark?" Victoria covered her face, her sobs breaking free. "I was afraid, my child. Afraid that if you knew, you might forgive him. I couldn't bear that thought. I was selfish, and that selfishness is what made you suffer." I watched mother and daughter embrace, and a rush of unnameable emotion swelled inside me. Perhaps, for the first time in years, the truth was no longer a weapon meant to wound, but a bridge slowly piecing the fragments back together. Thomas clasped Isabella's hand, his voice tender. "I don't care what my father did in the past anymore. All I know is, right now, I love you, and I want to walk forward with you, no longer letting hatred guide the way." The air in the room softened. Harsh words gave way to weary sighs. Accusations dissolved into sobs. I could feel it clearly. The storm was ebbing, leaving behind people sitting closer than before, not as enemies, but as souls bound by their own scars. I placed my hand on the table, steadying my voice though it trembled with both love and challenge. "My daughter, I have only one question for you. Do you want to begin again?" In that instant, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. The moment I asked the question, the room fell silent. Every gaze turned toward Isabella. She sat there, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders trembling. In her eyes I saw a fierce struggle between the hatred that had fueled her for years, and the yearning to live a lighter, freer life. She drew a deep breath, then nodded softly. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. "I want to try, Mother. I can't promise I'll forget everything, but I don't want to live in hatred anymore. I'm tired." Thomas broke into tears, clutching his wife as though afraid she might change her mind. "Thank you, Isabella. I promise, from this day on, we'll build true happiness together. No past will stand between us again." Isabella rested her head against his chest, eyes closing, as if for the first time she could finally let go after a long, exhausting journey. I sat quietly, feeling a weight lift from my heart. Perhaps, at last, we had found a way forward. That evening, for the first time in weeks, the family sat down to dinner without shouting. I set a simple meal on the table: roast chicken, stewed vegetables, and Dorothy's apple pie. Not a grand feast, yet the air carried a warmth I hadn't felt in so long. Thomas kept placing food on Isabella's plate, his eyes shining with renewed faith. She hesitated at first, then gave a small smile and whispered, "Thank you." Just one word, but to me, it was the first signal of a new beginning. Victoria sat opposite, watching her daughter quietly. She said little, only nodding now and then, as if silently accepting that the past should finally be laid to rest. I knew her scars still lingered, but at least she no longer wielded them to drag her daughter down. I looked around the table, and a rare sense of peace swelled in my chest. Faces once flushed with anger, eyes once burning with resentment now gathered together, sharing food and tentative smiles. Inwardly, I whispered, "Richard, do you see? At last, we have a chance to begin again." That dinner felt like a small miracle. No harsh words, no piercing stares, only a quiet calm. As I passed another serving of vegetables to Isabella and caught Thomas smiling softly at his wife, I saw his eyes glowing with fresh hope like a child finally waking from a nightmare. Just then, the front door opened. Dorothy stepped inside, the familiar basket in her hands, the scent of apple pie filling the air. She froze when she saw us gathered around the table, the atmosphere so different from the tense days that had come before. Setting the basket down, she pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes brimming. "Oh, finally, there's light," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feared you would collapse, Mary. But seeing this, I know you're still standing, and I see that all of you are finding your way back to one another." I smiled, my own tears threatening to fall. "Dorothy, maybe I'm not as strong as you think. I've trembled. I've been afraid, but I realized I couldn't let go. This is my family. I cannot allow it to drown in darkness." Dorothy nodded, her aged eyes shining with faith. "That is what keeps you standing, not perfection, but love." Her words struck something deep within me. For years, I had clung to Richard's image as a flawless man, but the truth was different. His legacy was not perfection. He had stumbled, he had betrayed, yet he had also sought to atone. And the true lesson was this: families cannot be built on lies or vengeance, but on love and forgiveness. I looked at Isabella, her face still weary from tears, but in her eyes, the first glimmer of peace had appeared. I looked at Thomas, his shoulders lighter, his hands still clasping his wife's tightly. And then at Victoria, the woman who had once entered this house with searing hatred, now silent, but no longer burning with fury. I drew a long breath, then spoke softly, just loud enough for all to hear. "Perhaps this is the true inheritance of a family. Not money, not honor. The true inheritance is the ability to forgive, the compassion we pass on to the next generation." The room fell still. Every pair of eyes turned toward me, each carrying its own reflection of the words. And I knew, more clearly than ever, out of pain, out of loss, we had discovered a new value, a new beginning. In the days following that fateful dinner, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Not all wounds vanished overnight, but I sensed that something new was beginning to grow. Isabella no longer walked with eyes sharp as blades. Instead, she started showing small gestures, quiet but meaningful. One morning, while I was busy in the kitchen, Isabella walked in. I braced myself for her usual piercing gaze, but instead, she softly said, "Mom, let me wash the dishes." I froze, hardly believing my ears. What did you just say?" A faint blush touched her cheeks, but she nodded firmly. "I've let you do too much already. I want to help." With trembling hands, I passed her a dish towel, watching her stand beside me, hands moving quickly as she rinsed each plate. A weight lifted from my heart. Perhaps, at last, we could truly become a family. Thomas noticed the change in his wife, and joy sparkled in his eyes. Each evening, the two of them would sit together on the porch, whispering to one another, their soft laughter drifting into the night air. Once, I overheard Thomas squeeze her hand and say, loud enough for me to catch, "I don't need a perfect marriage. I just need you with your real heart." Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder, silent, but her eyes looked at him with a tenderness I had never seen before. We decided to host a big family meal, inviting both sides to join. This time, there was no tension of accusations, no burning glares. Victoria came, looking weary but calm. She sat beside me, quiet, but when she picked up a piece of fish and placed it on my plate, she smiled faintly. I understood that was her way of admitting she wanted to leave hatred behind. Guests, those same people who had once whispered about the stain on my family at the wedding, now sat comfortably, eating, drinking, chatting. No one mentioned the storms of the past weeks. The house rang with laughter, the clinking of glasses bright and clear. I sat at the head of the table, my eyes wandering, My son and daughter-in-law sitting close together, gazes full of renewed love. Old friends like Dorothy laughing brightly, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Victoria nodding quietly as she watched her daughter smile again. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a family not broken, not burdened by the past, but daring to believe in tomorrow for the first time in many months. I truly felt this house return to its rightful meaning, a place where people could find peace. As time passed, the painful memories slowly found their place in a deep corner of the mind. They didn't vanish, but neither were they daggers cutting into the heart each time they were recalled. Instead, they became lessons, reminders for me and for the whole family of how vital love and forgiveness truly are. I began to notice Isabella's change more clearly with each passing day. She no longer kept her cold distance, no longer looked at me with defiant eyes. Instead, she often worked beside me around the house, asking small, gentle questions. "Are you tired, Mom? Or would you like me to cook dinner tonight?" Simple words, but to me, they were like doors quietly opening, leading toward genuine closeness. One afternoon, while I was trimming the rose bushes in front of the porch, Isabella brought me a cool glass of lemonade. She placed it in my hand and smiled. "I know you like this drink, Mom. I made it a little tart. Try it and see if it's right." I looked at her face, at the sincerity in her eyes I had never seen before. I took a sip, the sweet sour taste spreading warmly, and I smiled, nodding. "It's perfect, my dear." In that moment, my heart felt warm again. The daughter-in-law who once stepped into my house with vengeance in her heart was slowly becoming a true part of this family. Thomas, too, was happier. I often saw him holding Isabella's hand, his eyes filled with trust. Sometimes, I caught them planning their future together, talking about a small home of their own they hoped to build. His voice no longer carried weariness. Instead, it held the eager tone of a man who truly believed in his marriage. Victoria visited less often now, but whenever she did, she came with a calmer demeanor. We did not become friends, but we were no longer enemies either. I believe that, in her heart, much of the bitterness had finally eased. Then one day, Thomas embraced me, his eyes glistening. "Mom, next week is our first wedding anniversary. Isabella and I want to host a small dinner, just you, Aunt Dorothy, and a few close friends. But this time, there will be no shadows, only joy." I looked at my son, my heart swelling with emotion. A year ago, that wedding had unleashed a storm. Now, its anniversary carried the promise of a new journey. And I realized, at last, that the cycle of pain and forgiveness had led us all into the light. I still remember so vividly the day Thomas and Isabella were married. I thought it would be the happiest day of my life. Yet that happiness lasted only a fleeting moment, before the storm of truth and resentment swept everything away. We have walked a long road through the laughter of the wedding day, into the accusations that tore trust apart, and through the tears shed in the night of confrontation. I watched my son collapse under the weight of discovering that the father he once idolized was flawed, and I saw my daughter-in-law carry a heart scarred by growing up in hatred. And yet, amid all that ruin, we found another path, the path of truth and forgiveness. Truth, though painful, freed us from lies and misunderstandings. Forgiveness, though difficult, opened the way for love to be reborn. I think often of Richard, the man who left me both wounds and sweet memories. He was not perfect, and I will not excuse his mistakes. But now I understand. What he left behind was not only memories or possessions, but a precious lesson that human beings may stumble and fall, may make mistakes. But what matters most is whether they have the courage to rise and seek to make things right. I told Dorothy, and later Thomas and Isabella, that the greatest legacy a person can leave is not wealth or fame. Money fades, reputation can wither, but compassion, the ability to open one's heart to love and to forgive, is what endures across generations. When I see Isabella washing dishes beside me, or Thomas helping his wife prepare a meal. I see clearly that seed being sown anew. They are learning to care for one another, to listen, to place love above resentment. And I know this is the gift I, as a mother, a widow, and a witness, must pass on. The first anniversary of Thomas and Isabella's marriage arrived. No grand feast, no bustling orchestra, just a simple meal. A few dear friends, and the familiar faces who had weathered the storm together now gathered in peace. After dinner, Thomas suddenly took out a camera. "Mom," he called to me, his voice bright like when he was a child. "Let's take a family picture. After everything we've been through this year, in the end, we're still here, together." We stood in a row on the porch, Dorothy at my side, her hand gently clasping mine as if to lend me strength. Victoria stood by her daughter, not the angry woman of the past, but a mother who had learned to let go. Thomas wrapped his arm around Isabella, and Isabella leaned softly into him, her eyes glowing with a tenderness rarely seen before. I stood in the middle, smiling. Click. The shutter went off. In that fleeting instant, I realized it is not perfection, but the scars, the tears, the moments of falling and rising again that truly make a family. When everyone went back inside, I remained on the porch, gazing at the photo glowing on the camera screen. A message swelled within me, one I knew I must share, not only with my children and grandchildren, but with anyone who has ever been caught in the spiral of hatred. I turned toward the audience, my eyes steady, my voice slow and deliberate. Hatred can destroy a family, even a lifetime, but love, however small, however late, can still heal. Richard left us one lesson. Mistakes are not the end, but a reminder that forgiveness is the only path back to peace. I paused, my heartbeat pounding in my chest. Then I asked, with all the sincerity I could summon, as if reaching for each soul listening, if it were you, would you choose revenge, or would you choose forgiveness? My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.